Yeah, hello, I'm here.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for coming. So it's all yours.
Thank you for the invitation. Let me try to share my screen. Okay, thanks for inviting me here. So it's a great pleasure to have this chance to come here and introduce my work. So a quick introduction about myself. So I'm a robotist. So my research is on understanding tactile sensing and how robots can use touch sensing to better understand and interact with the physical world. So today I'm going to talk about some of my work in the past about using learning method to help robots to better understand the tactile sensing. So I will talk about some of the example tasks and or methodologies we use to handling the high-resolution tactile signals. Okay, so I start. We probably need to start with a most basic question. What is tactile sensing? So as the word indicates, tactile sensing means that the sensing related to touch. But the definition is a little bit tricky. Like touch is like the way of sensing, but what kind of physical signal are we trying to sense here? So according to like the objects of sensing, like whether it's a human or robots, it may mean different things. But traditionally, how robotics people think about tactile sensing is that they define that as a measurement of a distribution of normal force. So in other words, so here is an example showing a typical traditional tactile sensors. So these are, so those blue areas are sensors covering the fingertips and the palm of this robot hand. And within each blue areas, so there are several independent cells, and each cells can measure the normal force happening at that exact location. So here shows an example of like a human is pressing on the in the middle of this fingertip, and within this finger pad there are like 4x8 individual tactile cells, and each of them are mirroring the normal force at that location. So that you can see that this is what we can read from the tactile sensors. It's like a round area with a pretty high pressure in the middle and much lower pressures in the peripheral area. So for this particular sensors, the spatial resolution is around 5 millimeters. So that means like the distance between the two different cells is around 5 millimeters. So this is also like pretty typical for other traditional tactile sensors. So you can see that with this kind of sensors, a robot can detect touch and understand what's the approximate force at the touch surface and what's the contact areas and what's the approximate shape of the contact areas. So this can help robots in multiple ways. So here shows some examples of pretty classical ways robots can use tactile sensing to perceive and interact with the physical environment. So the first case showing that like the robot is trying to grasp some delicate objects, which is a jelly in this case. So it can use the feedback from the tactile sensors to understand what is the current force, so that it can better control the force and not to break the objects. So in the second example here, this robot is trying to recognize the shape of the objects according to the contact areas. So here it can get a distribution map of the contact surface, contact map of the distribution of normal force. So in this particular case, it's a handle of the cup. So you can detect these patterns of this handle. So that patterns can help robots to recognize, hey, this is something long and thin and long is probably like similar to a cup of the handle of the cup. And the third case shows the third example shows another case where the robot is trying to classify the materials according to the textures. So here the robot is trying to use vibration information. So it will slide the fingers across the surface of this across this surface, and the different texture patterns will generate some special vibration patterns. And by collecting these vibration patterns, which can be considered as a temporal change of the normal force at the contact surface, the robot can well classify what kind of texture it is. So those rules show some examples about like what we can do if we can use tactile sensor to detect contact and the normal force. But we can see that the constraints about those Those examples is that those tasks are relatively simple and only works in some well-constrained settings. And what the sensor can provide is only very limited information about the contact. So we also want the robot to be able to understand more, to get more information from the environment. So we start to think that what happens if the robot is able to get more, much richer information about the contact, especially what happens if we can get very high resolution information about the contact surface. So then we develop a new tactile sensor called GelSight. So it's a vision-based tactile sensors, and here shows some examples about how it works. Oops, sorry, the video, it got stuck. So we can see that here is a human pressing the sensors on different objects, and there are some optical designs inside the sensors, and also a camera. And we can use a camera to capture what happens on this contact surface, and which indicates both the geometry of the contact as well as the force. So the second window here shows the geometry. So where we can see that there's some significant change of the colors during the contact process. So that indicates the surface normal and geometry of the objects being in contact. So on the other hand, we have those black markers painted on the surface of the sensors, and we can track the motion of those markers, and that indicates the contact force. So how did the sensor works? Here shows basic examples about the sensors. So the centerpiece of it is a piece of clear elastomer, and it is painted with a reflective membrane. So when the elastomer is in contact with the external objects, it may deform, and that may cause the change in the reflection of this membrane. And especially that will cause some shadings according to the geometry and change of the surface normal. So in other words, if we put a camera on the other side and capture how this shadings changes, so we can get a good indications about the geometry of the contact surface. So especially like we can set the lights from different directions with different colors, so that we can get good information about like what happens about the shadings when we have the lights shining from different directions. So, and after we have an image like this from the USB cameras, we can perform a photometric stereos about this on this image, and then reconstruct the 3D shape of the object surface. And finally, if we get this working and integrate all the components, including the elastomer, the camera, the lightings into a small box, and we can finally make a small sensor like this. And this is small enough to be captured, to be carried by a robot gripper. So the robot can use the gripper, use the sensor as one of the fingertip, and move it around and grasp different objects and touch different surface and get to know what is happening on the contact surface. So apart from that, we also paint those markers on the surface and simply track the motion of them. So the motion of the markers shows the stretch of the soft surface on the sensors, which is closely related to the contact force. So to be specific, so on the different type of contact force, either is like normal force or shear force or the torque, those motion of the markers will make different type of patterns, such as like either they will spread outside, or they will all move to one directions, or they form some rotational patterns. And also the magnitude of the motion of the markers corresponds to the magnitude of the force and torque. Okay, so here is this is a brief summary introduction about how the sensor works. So in short, it's a high-resolution tactile sensor, which is able to get like very fine details about the shapes and texture of the objects. And also we can use the markers to estimate the overall force and including the shear force and the torque. Okay, any questions so far about the sensor design? Okay. Okay, now we know how the sensor works. So it's pretty nice, like since it can provide very rich information about both the geometry and the force. Now the question is that, how can this high resolution tactile information help robots? So the simplest things we can think about is that since now we have those high resolution information about geometry, so we can get a precise measurement about the shape of the objects and the textures. So we can easily recognize the textures and the objects shapes based on those high resolution tactile images. So here is an example of the works my colleagues did in 2013. They try to recognize the materials based on the texture. So they just collect a bunch of high-resolution tactile images with the GelSight sensors and perform some classical texture classification algorithms and recognize what type of texture it is. And therefore, we can easily recognize what type of material it is. So it works pretty well. But also we want to understand, can we go beyond that? Can we understand more information about the physical property of the objects? So specifically, we are thinking about this case of like a human peeling an avocados, which we may do a lot in the supermarket because we want to understand whether the avocado is ready to eat or is too raw. So what does it mean by avocado is ready to eat? So that can be indicated by the hardness of the avocado. So we know that a ready-to-eat avocado is like a moderate hardness. So if it's too hard, that means it's too raw to eat, or it might be too soft, that means it's already rotten. So it's like it's not good for the health, and you probably don't want to buy it. So as a human, we can easily measure the hardness of the objects based on like a single touch on the surface of the objects. The question is that whether a robot can do similar things. We did a simple experiment on trying to press our GelSight sensors on a object. It's a spherical object made by deformable rubbers. And we know that like, since the GelSight captures the geometry with pretty high resolutions, so we can see the geometry of the object surface based on the geometry indicated from the deformations of the gel pad. But on the other hand, if the object itself is also deformable, so it may deform during this pressing process. So that like, if the object is hard, if you press on the surface, the geometry almost remains the same when you have like different magnitude of the contact force. But on the other hand, if the object is pretty soft, and that means like when you press on the top of the surface objects, it may have a significant deformation that will cause a big change in the geometry of the object surface. So the good thing is that we can use GelSight to measure the geometry exactly. So we can use that information to indicate the hardness of the objects. So let's look back in this particular case on pressing hemispherical sphere rubber. So this is what we can see from the GelSight images. So you can see that there's some change in the shadings from different colors, and this in a round area, and this contact area is expanding as the contact force proceed. So that means like we can detect this like hemispherical shape, and as time goes, this force is larger and contact area is much larger. And we also did an experiment with another samples that is also hemispherical of exactly the same shape, but it's made of a much softer material. And this is the data we can see this time. So we can see like it's still a round area, so indicating that it's some shape very close to a hemispherical shape, but the color change is much smaller. So that corresponds to a much smoother surface. So this because like this sample is much softer. So during the press, the shape got flattened out. So that like that make the shading change to be much smaller. So in other words, like the change in the physical process, like regarding to whether the object is harder or softer, that will cause a significant change in the data we get from the GelSight. So that like we can just measure how this shading changes as the time goes, as well as if we can measure the force from the motion of the markers. Like usually when you press on softer objects, the normal force is much smaller. So we can get a good estimation about what's the hardness of the objects. But in this process, like a big challenge is like, what happens if the shape of the object is unknown, or is even some very complicated shapes or arbitrary shapes? So here I'm showing you some examples of some other shapes of objects, especially in the first two rows. So those objects are of like different shapes, but like the pair of them are of exactly the same shape, but the hardness level is different. So you can see that we can get a combination of like different geometry and how geometry changes as time goes, and how the force changes as the time goes. And how can we understand the hardness from this highly nonlinear and very high dimensional data? So we decide like the neural network could be probably the only solution at this moment. So we build a deep neural network structure like this. So this is a neural network combining a convolutional neural network and a recurrent neural network. So firstly, we get a video of the press sequence when we use a GelSight sensor to press on the top of different objects. And then we sample several frames in the sequence indicating what happens when the force grows from small to larger and larger. And each individual frames will feed into a convolutional neural network structures, which is used to analyze the spatial information within one single frames. So in this case, the spatial information is about like what's the shape of the contact surface and what's the motion of the markers that corresponds to the contact force. And after that, information flows into a recurrent neural network structure. So this structure is trying to calculate how this information changes as the time goes. So especially like if the geometry of the objects is unknown, so compared to like the exact geometry of the objects, what's more important to us is like how this geometry changes and how force changes as the time goes. So this recurrent neural networks build a correlation and try to understand the temporal change of those information. And finally, it can output a number that corresponds to the number of the hardness level of these target objects. So in order to train our neural network, we need to collect a data set of a bunch of different objects with different hardness level. So here we made a data set based on using silicone casting. So we use different materials and combine them so that we can get casting samples of 16 different hardness levels. And then we also got a bunch of different modes with different geometry, different parameters, and even some very complicated shape geometries custom with silicones, so that we have a widely distributed shapes of the objects with a different hardness level, and those hardness level is well known and well controlled. And we also collect some data set on some natural objects such as fruit, candies, and human bodies. So for those natural objects, we don't really have a ground truth of the hardness levels, but we can also use a reference from the human's estimation to get some estimation about like the relative hardness of those objects. So here shows our results on like performing the hardness predictions on the silicone samples where we have the ground truth of the hardness levels. And in those cases, we've shown the examples about like when the shapes of the objects is seen, but hardness level is unseen, or the shape is unseen, or the contact mode is totally different, such as the contact is conducted by the robot. So in all those cases, we can see that like the robot can get a relative close estimation about the hardness levels of different objects. And specifically, we also want to understand whether that can help robots to pick up avocados from the supermarket. So here we ask humans to put 2 avocados and rank them according to the hardness, and then we press a GelSight sensor on the avocado surface and get some data and try to estimate the hardness according to the tactile sequence. And it can be seen that the estimated hardness levels matches the estimation of human perception. Okay, so this shows like how we can use high-resolution tactile sensing to estimate the hardness levels of objects. So we can see that it's a combination of like both physical process and also learning methods about like describing how this data is different according to the different like physical properties. Any questions so far? Okay, so now we have another questions. So can we make the robot to do the explorations in a closed loop instead of like making a human to press the sensors on the surface of the robot, on the surface of different objects? And can we extend the range of the objects we can perceive, like not constrained to the silicone samples, but like to some more natural objects? So we start our next explorations on perceiving clothing. And especially we are considering like a wide variety of common clothes, which they are different in like the materials and the sizes and the shapes and the weight and a lot of different things. So in this case, we want the robot to be able to explore all those materials by all those clothing by itself. And since those clothes are different in many different ways, and there are lots of related properties that we can use to describe those clothes. So we want the robot to get a more thorough understanding, like not only labeling the hardness, but a bunch of different physical properties as well. And we also want the robot to do the exploration automatically. So, but the good thing is that the tactile information is also pretty significant when the robot touch different clothes with the GelSight sensor. So here shows examples when the robot is trying to squeeze on different kind of materials, and what we can see from the GelSight view. So here you can see that as the contact goes, firstly, the texture is pretty significant. So we can see that different materials may have a very different shape of the textures on the surface. But other than that, also there's other like global information, such as what's the shape of the contact area surface, like is it like the robot squeezing on a very soft surface and it's changing very slowly, or is a very rigid surface, like it's not really deformable and suddenly cuts the shape. And also like when there are some foldings on the surface of the on the contact surface, what's the shape of the foldings? It is are they all very sharp foldings or very soft foldings? So all those informations are very informative about like not only the type of the material, but also the internal properties of the material. So specifically, we talk with some humans about like what do we think are important properties about the clothing, and we summarize 8 physical properties like the thickness, smoothness, fuzziness, and also some semantic properties regarding to how robots can handle those clothing at home. And those semantic properties includes like wearing seasons, like is this winter clothes or summer clothes, and washing method, can we use a washing machine to wash them? Can we use warm water or only cold water? And also the tactile type. And then we ask human to label those cloth materials based on each different properties into those discrete classes. And then we perform a classifications on those tactile data and try to map that, classify them into different classes and based on those physical labels and semantic labels. So the next step we want to understand is how the robot can do the automatic explorations. So to do that, we need to have some global information about the clothes and the working environment. So we set up a working environment for the robot like this. So up here, other than the grippers and GelSight sensors, we also have a vision sensor, which is a Kinect sensor up here, so which can take an image and depth image of the entire workspace, especially where is the cloth and what's the shape of the cloth. So based on this output from the Kinect sensors, the robot will try to figure out what is a good place to touch on the clothes, to squeeze on the clothes to collect the tactile data. And finally, it will go there and squeeze on those locations and collect some tactile data. And we use the tactile data to understand what's the physical properties of the material. So in other words, like there's this process is two steps. So firstly, the robot is away from the cloth. We take an image of the entire cloth, especially we find the depth image, which indicates the shape of the cloth is mostly helpful here. We use that to train a neural network to decide whether some points are good for gripping or not good for gripping. And after that, we came out with a best point for robots to grip on. And the robot will go ahead and collect some tactile data. And then the data goes through another deep neural network structures and trying to do a multi-class classifications and try to recognize like different properties of these materials based on the tactile input. But then there's a question coming from this process. What happens if the data is bad. So what happens like if the first step doesn't work well enough or something happens, something was wrong in the middle, and the robot still collects some tactile data, but it's not a very good tactile data. So the neural network may be confused and cannot recognize the properties properly. How should that do? So firstly, we want to understand when would that happen. And we figure out that as far as the prediction on the classification stage, it's not very centralized. Or in other words, the confidence of the classification is not very high. It's more likely means like this tactile data is very bad. So in this case, we may just tell that means like this data is bad, the robot needs to go back and redo the work. So we will ask the robot to relay the shape, the clothes to change its shape and do another snapshot of the shape of the clothes and choose another point to grasp and then collect the new tactile data and try to understand the physical properties based on the new data. So this loop will go on until the robot is pretty confident about the prediction of the properties of the cloth. So here shows some examples about how this process works. So firstly, the robot find the location, go down and squeeze on the cloth. So it's a nice clothes location, but it's kind of confusing, but because there was a button in the middle, and that got the network to be pretty confused. So the robot will go back, relay the clothes, and grasp on the second location. So this is a bad location. So there's simply nothing in context. So the robot will just go pull back and do another grasp. And this time it's a nice location and the data is good. And the robot is, and the network can give a pretty confident prediction about the properties of this cloth, and then that's the point we see that we are good, we have a good understanding of the clothes. And in this particular task, this robot is actually trying to do a laundry sorting. So based on this understanding of the cloth, it will decide this piece of shirt can be washed by washing machine, but only with a cold washing and gentle cycle. So it put the clothes into that corresponding washing basket. So we found that like with this closed loop exploration task, the perception really can be improved significantly. So here I'm listing a bunch of different type of physical properties, for example, for thickness. So the random guess gives a chance of 0.2. That means like we have 5 classes for this particular labels. If you ask the robot to grasp the cloth and estimate the thickness on a totally new piece of cloth, it can get things correct with a chance of 0.59. But if we ask the robot to do a closed loop exploration, and it will finally get the prediction correct with a chance of 0.65. Okay. Okay, so this tells about how we can use a robot to explore the physical properties of the clothing based on tactile data. And in this process, of course, vision is important. So it helps the robot to understand where is a good point to grasp, to touch. So this is very important because usually tactile sensing only can provide very local information, although it could be very fine and it could be very precise, but it's only within a very small range of the part. But on the other hand, vision can provide global information, so it can cover a much larger area. So the question is that, can we exactly combine vision and touch together at the same time in order to get a better perception of the objects? So here we're using examples of fabric perception as well. So here we try to make things a little bit simpler to well-controlled experiment. So we just try to drape this piece of fabrics from a pose in this environment and take some pictures. So by looking at these pictures, we can get lots of feelings about this piece of fabrics. So by looking at the shape of the drape and the shape of the foldings and the gloss on the surface, we can get a feeling about this piece of fabrics, like it can feel like it's kind of flexible and it's thin, it's a little bit weighty, has a smooth surface, stretchy. And of course, like if I tell you like there's a piece of fabrics that is a flexible, stretchy, thin, and weighty, and I ask you to drape it from a piece of pose. So you can imagine it might form some shapes like this. So on the other hand, we can also touch the piece of fabrics. And by doing different kind of interactions with this piece of fabrics, we can get some feeling about the physical properties as well. So this may comes from the same piece, same bunch of a description of the fabrics, because in essence, it's the same piece of fabrics, right? Like we can watch them from the different point of views. We can touch them on different locations. We can like drift them again from another pose where like if pixel wise, it will be totally a different image. But like still like we can still get the same piece of information about this piece of fabrics because it's the same one. And of course, like when we think about like how can we describe this piece of fabrics, our description is also limited by our language. Like we do have some good modelings of the fabrics of the in our mind, but the way only a small part of them can be described in the language. So now we will come to the question that like, is there a way we can have a better representations of the material of the fabrics, especially like, can we build a implicit representations of those fabrics, like skipping the process of language, but get some models closer to the way those objects are described in our mind? And furthermore, can we use the can we use this model to help us to imagine what the fabric may touch like when we look at them, or may imagine what it will look like if we touch them? So specifically, we are trying to ask these questions. We want to find these representations of the object properties that only describes the material and environment of its configurations and the sensor modalities. So that means like if we drape it for multiple times or look at it from different directions or touch it at different locations, we always know that it's the same piece of materials. We have these invariant representations. So we want to find these representations with some machines. How do we do that? So we design a neural network structures to get this implicit embeddings vectors to describe this piece of materials. So we hope this neural network can take in a color image and run through a bunch of trainings and finally get a vector to describe the material properties of this piece of fabrics. And of course, we can have other modalities such as the depth image, which is only describes the shape of the fabrics and not influenced by the visual textures or the colors. And we can also touch it with the GelSight. And we have those information. We feed that into the we feed each of them into individual neural networks and come up with embedding vectors to describe the properties of this piece of fabrics. And although like those networks are different, the input are different, and finally the vectors are different, so we know that it comes from the same piece of fabrics. So we hope the representations of this piece of fabric is the same, so that we train it to make sure like this E1, E2, E3 are as close as possible if it comes from the same piece of fabrics, or if they comes from the different piece of fabrics, we hope them to be far away. So finally, we use this to train our network, and we get the representations of the fabrics. And although we don't know the physical meaning of that, but we know that it describes some properties of fabrics, and it's also quantitarized so that it can be used to describe the similarities of the two perceptions from two modalities. So in other words, we can try to do an interesting task, like if we touch a fabrics and we got a bunch of candidate fabrics images, either it's color images and depth images. Can we guess like which piece of the fabrics did we just touch? So this is straightforward if we had this network that can generate the description of the fabrics. So we can just feed in a tactile image into a network and get a description. So in this particular case, if you look at these tactile images, we may imagine that it's some knit materials. So it may have some description, may have some physical properties or the appearance like this shape. And then we run the networks over a bunch of candidate visual inputs and measure the distance between the embedding vectors. So in this particular case, we find that like in our in the data set of 10 candidate images. So these the first one has the closest distance comparing to the embedding vectors of the query tactile signals, and that exactly shows that exactly matches the ground truth. So this is exactly the piece of fabrics we just touched. But also, like, there are some other pieces like the second one and the third one where the distance are also pretty close. They are not the ones we just touched, but you can see from the visual images that those three pieces of fabrics are kind of close, so that are close regarding to the physical properties. So that makes their distance in the embeddings representations much closer. While the other one, so this is the one, the last one is the candidate that with the largest distance. So this is a satin material. We can see from the picture it looks pretty stiff. So it's pretty distinctive from the fabrics we just touched. And in this case, the distance is the furthest from the query signal. So this is another case where if we have a image like a tactile case like this, so we can see from the tactile images, this feels like some material that is soft, warm, and thick. So again, like we combine with a bunch of inquiry signals, and we find that like although this time it didn't got exactly the correct cases, but the first two or even the third one is pretty close in the material properties, while the last one is pretty far regarding to the physical properties. So we can even draw a confusion matrix based on like all the fabrics in our test data set. So we can see that like generally the distribution is pretty close to the diagonals, but there are also kind of groups because like some of them are kind of similar in each group. So our networks can hardly distinguish them well enough, but like the correlation between the groups are much lower. So this means like our neural network is not exactly learning which is the identity of the fabrics, but instead it's trying to find a quantitative way to describe the physical properties of the fabrics, and that shows the similarities of the materials. Okay, so that is what we did in the past. Something we also very interested in recently is build the tactile sensing in simulation environment. So this is exactly helpful, like if you want to collect large scale of data set or understand whether one system will work or not before we really build up the real robot system. So in this case, we try to explore two ways to build the simulation models for the sensors, either by modeling the physics of the sensor exactly, or using a data-driven method, which can work much faster and get a realistic signals considering the noise in the sensor as well. And here shows some examples of our simulation results where we put on archive recently. So now by the comparison, we can see that like we can pretty closely simulate both the geometry caused the optical change as well as the macro motion caused by the contact force. So in our another work we just submitted recently, we try to use simulation to help the robot to better estimate the overall shape of the objects. So here we try to reconstruct the 3D shape of the objects from both vision and touch. So we use vision to get a preliminary estimation of the shape and use touch to refine the model. So here we want to understand how touch is more precisely representing the shapes. So we trained the neural network to estimate both the height map and the contact mass from the tactile images. And all the data here is collected in simulation, but still transfer pretty nicely to the real robot cases, like in both simulation environment and real world environment. We can construct the 3D shapes of the all objects. Okay, that's an overview of what we have been doing. So I would like thanks to all my collaborators on that. So a bunch of them are work I conducted when I was at MIT, and also the recent work on simulation is finished by my students at SMU. And thank you for listening. I'm open to your questions now.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. So I have a side question, so kind of related to the future direction. So since this is a computer vision conference, so we don't have much knowledge in the like a touch-based method, those sensing and robotics, but we do want to explore this area for multimodality research. So do you have any recommendation on how we do that? So for example, we don't have the hardware like the sensing cells or any public data set we can use to do some joint computer vision robotics research?
So most of the projects I shown today, the data set is published. So I also saw some other people use our public data set for either repeat our tasks or further or to like do some add-on tasks based on what we have been doing. And also another thing I think is a good direction for the future and for the community is the simulation tools. So it's already open sourced. So we are still working on like making the code more organized and easier to read now, but we are already collaborating with multiple labs now. And our goal is to make sure this library is available for many people so that like we can easily collect GelSight data in simulation now.
Oh, great.